Good afternoon. Welcome to the 4th Annual Catholic Intellectual Tradition Symposium. Thanks for being with us. I'm Tim Gabrielli and privileged to serve as Goodorf Chair in Catholic Intellectual Traditions. And along with my colleague, Dr. Sandra Yoakum, University Professor of Faith and Culture, we co-sponsor this symposium. And I'm really glad you could join us this afternoon. We're reaching the end of really a two-day jaunt. We started yesterday morning and went throughout yesterday and again this morning and throughout the day today. Really, if you have a program and glance at the program, I think it'll give you a really nice snapshot of the diversity of ways in which undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty from across the units at the university are connecting with this kind of conversation that's been going on for more than 2,000 years. Our next presentation is part of a subset of presentations at the symposium that are students, undergraduate students, who have won the McGrath Award. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the McGrath Award and then introduce our next presenter who will share with you his award-winning research. So the McGrath Award is sponsored by my office, and it's named in honor of UD alumnus Father Jack McGrath. Father McGrath was a dedicated teacher who celebrated and embodied Marianist education in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Across his illustrious career, which spanned nearly 60 years, Father McGrath taught high schoolers, undergraduates, graduate students in a range of disciplines, including math and American history and theology. Math and history and theology. There's CIT. Among many other roles in the Society of Mary, he served as a faculty member at UD beginning in 1987, where he founded the Forum on the Catholic Intellectual Tradition Today, which is carried on by Dr. Yoakum's office, the University Professor of Faith and Culture. So the McGrath Award then recognizes students whose research in a common academic program course demonstrates careful, deep, and creative engagement with thinkers, texts, and/or themes associated with Catholic intellectual traditions. So having applied this past fall semester with work completed in 2023, either in the spring, summer, or fall, this year's recipients were selected from a very strong pool of applicants. I really can't emphasize that enough. The committee had a really difficult time selecting this year's 6 awardees in both the first year sophomore and then junior senior categories, so 3 each. So each recipient receives a $750 award, along with a special medallion. And it's probably hard for you to see this, but it's very small, but the medallion features on the front of it an image, and it's an image of a little statue that was very dear to Father McGrath. And Dr. Yoakum and I have tried to trace down its provenance. It seems that it probably came from a general council of the Marianists in Rome in 1973. And Father McGrath held on to it and then passed it on to Dr. Yoakum. But it's a Mary seat of wisdom. And so this is an ancient title for Mary, and one I think that's dear to our campus. Jesus sitting on her lap. I think it reminds all of us who stand in the Marianist tradition of education that really the pursuit of wisdom is an encounter with God. So without further ado, I'll give Jules his medal. I'll also point out that this is Jules' second McGrath Award. Excellent research in the course. And I think last year he asked me if he had to wear it while I presented, and I said, absolutely. So I'm going to put it on and turn it over to Jules.
Hi guys, wow. Can you guys all hear me? Okay? Good, wonderful. All right, so before I go on here, I want to do some acknowledgments. I want to thank, firstly, my faculty advisor, Dr. Susan Trollinger, who wanted to make sure that I informed all of you that she's regretful that she can't be here. Unfortunately, the ASI 120 students, which if you're familiar with the core program, they've got a midterm exam coming up, their first exam. So she's got to be in class right now to prepare for that, as does her husband. So neither of them can make it, but she sends her regrets. And I also, of course, I'd like to thank my family who's here, my fiance, for all supporting me through all of these different times that I've written these papers. So thank you all also just for being here. It's really awesome to have an audience. So, as Dr. Gabriele said, my name is Jules Carr-Chellman. And in the spring of 2022, I took Dr. Susan Trollinger's class on the visual rhetorics of American evangelicalism and the Amish. So to get a first-hand perspective on these visual rhetorics, our class spent an entire day at the Creation Museum, and then we spent another day at the world's largest Amish settlement, which actually happens to be here in Ohio, interestingly enough. Both trips were fantastic, but I was especially struck by what I saw at the Creation Museum. So today we're going to be talking about a visual rhetorical analysis that I conducted of the security forces, specifically at the Creation Museum, and why this rhetorical argument, what I'm going to argue is a rhetorical argument, is worth paying attention to. In May of 2007, Ken Ham and his Young Earth Creationist Apologetics Ministry, Answers in Genesis, which I will refer to throughout this presentation as AIG. So you hear me say AIG, it's Answers in Genesis, which is his Young Earth Apologetics Ministry. They completed the construction of a $27 million, 75,000 square foot creation museum without taking on a dime of debt, thanks to some handy and generous tax benefits by the state of Kentucky. The construction of the Creation Museum, it marked the beginning of Ken Ham and AIG's tenure as among some of the chief interpreters of God's Word that we have today. AIG and other Young Earth creationists argue that the Earth is not just the Earth, but the entire universe is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. And I think, why so young? Why do they think that it's so young? And according to AIG, the reason for this is because a literal reading of the Bible, which is the only reading of the Bible that is accepted by Ken Ham and AIG, that requires an Earth that is so young. So Ken Ham and AIG, they exert a great deal of influence among white conservative Christians in America. So it's important to take a careful and a critical look at the Creation Museum and what's going on in Boone County, Kentucky. What stood out to me were AIG's security measures. So whether or not the Creation Museum and its employees face actual threats to their safety, the very visible presence of armed security personnel at the Creation Museum encourages visitors to identify as a member of a persecuted religious people. More specifically, I argue in this paper, and hopefully today, that the security forces and the measures at the Creation Museum do not merely exist to protect visitors or property, but also to send a very powerful message to visitors that the visitors that are invested in the central argument of this museum are a persecuted people. But as any good rhetorician does with visual and material rhetoric, we have to actually, before we get into any analysis or argumentation, we have to observe what actually is at the museum itself, right? So what does the museum actually look like? The Creation Museum itself is set back quite a distance from the parking lot, and it features a long array of anti-terrorist solid concrete planters, which you can see up here, the middle picture. These are all photos, almost all photos that I took here. Obviously not the one where it's under construction though. So the one where it's under construction, you can see those are very large concrete planters, and I think if you drove a car into that, it would probably hurt you more than the planter itself. So they're very substantial concrete planters through which you cannot fit a car. So upon entering the premises of the museum itself, visitors are required to be screened by a metal detector, and within the building, once you pass through this metal detector, you can observe actually between 2 to 3 armed guards and also some canine handlers that are standing on the outside of various doors to the interior of the building. So the posted officers, they're not visible from the front entrance when you walk in, but it's only once you've entered in that they're positioned outside of large central glass windows that are most visible upon entrance to the museum. The security officers that are inside of the museum wear distinctly official uniforms that resemble that of a state trooper Class A uniform. Interior guards, they wear a wide-brimmed campaign hat, a bluish-gray short-sleeved button-up with a large metallic badge, black duty pants, combat boots, and a patch that resembles one you might find on a real law enforcement officer's uniform. The security officers at the Creation Museum, they're all equipped with a full peace officer utility belt that includes a .40 caliber Glock handgun, handcuffs, mace, 2 extra clips of ammunition, and a taser as well. So all of this, like you see when you walk in and you see security guards at the museum, you see this, right? You see all of these things here. So as we think about the visual rhetoric of security at the Creation Museum, I think it's very important to remember that Protestant fundamentalism has long cultivated an identity as a persecuted people. With the rising dominance of evolution in the scientific community, and with historical criticism that treats the Bible just like any other historical text, fundamentalists have felt profoundly under siege. By the first couple of decades, I think in the first 20th century, modernity, it left a lot of conservative Christians feeling alienated from their own culture. And so you can see up here this image, you can take from it what you want, but this image on the screen is a 1926 cartoon of the Ku Klux Klan chasing the Roman Catholic Church, which is personified as St. Patrick from the shores of America. So, whatever you'd like to think about this particular image being placed in this particular presentation, you may. But I'm not saying that the fundamentalist Christian right today is composed of Klan members necessarily, but what I am saying is that during this time, the Klan, it was very anti-Catholic, and its mission was primarily directed toward white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So in other words, so what I'm saying here is that the fundamentalist Protestant Christian right has always felt the need to defend itself. And this sentiment remains, I think. It would appear that the Creation Museum, through its very visible display of security personnel, is making the most of this historical experience of alienation and self-defense. It's really quite a picture, isn't it? Yeah. It's something else. So each security officer that's uniformed at the Creation Museum wears a dark-colored campaign hat with flat, wide brims that extend equidistantly from the band of the hat to form the shape of a circle. The campaign hat, it's an iconic form, as we would say in Dr. Trollinger's class. So on the one hand, it's a hat that it can be understood as just something maybe that one wears on their head to gain protection from the elements or maybe additional warmth, what have you. But this campaign hat at the Creation Museum, I believe, has an additional rhetorical function. And this is because it calls to mind the hats that are worn by state troopers, by military drill sergeants, and federal border patrol officers, among many others, right? These people with lots of authority. So these are some of the photos that I took. I followed this guy around the museum, so I'm still here to tell you about it. I'm in shot. So these are some of the photos that I took of one of the patrolling security officers at the museum. And for reference, here are these are photos of Kentucky State Troopers and what they look like. And yes, if you're having a hard time distinguishing aside from the big yellow text, I think that's very intentional, and that's something I'm trying to point out today, is that these are actual law enforcement officers, and they can place you under arrest, and they're important people, right? But the people before the security officer that you saw, he doesn't do anything really, in the way that these guys do. So, but they look like they do, So I guess whether or even how much Creation Museum visitors need protection from hostile forces is pretty unclear. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the Creation Museum, it does its level best to construct its security personnel as surrogates for the police. So by making Answers in Genesis security personnel look like state or municipality police, and by positioning them visibly outside and inside of the museum, the Creation Museum is relentlessly indicating to visitors that they are under a real and present threat. So security officers carry a .40 caliber Glock handgun. Each security officer carrying a deadly firearm is given the responsibility of deciding whether each guest will perish or remain alive during their visit. And all security personnel employed by AIG are required to sign a faith statement that reads the following. All human life is sacred and begins at conception, defined as the moment of fertilization. Each unborn child is a unique, living human being, created in the image of God, and must be respected and protected both before and after birth. The abortion of an unborn child or the active, intentional taking of human life through euthanasia or assisted suicide constitutes a violation of the sanctity of human life and is a crime against God and man. Thus, the deadly weapons at the Creation Museum must serve a purpose other than to take away life. And this is because those who wield them are contractually prohibited from, quote, the intentional taking of human life, end quote. It's a fact that firearms shoot bullets, and that a properly placed bullet will take away a human life. And so what we're seeing here is that a handgun inside of a holster must be symbolic. Security guards carrying .40 caliber Glocks at the Creation Museum, they're part of a rhetorical message to the fundamentalist Christian museum attendees that their belief system is subject to a degree of hostility that warrants armed guards. The Creation Museum chooses to protect their premises with armed guards who cannot fire weapons on human beings, apparently. Which means that deadly firearms serve a rhetorical purpose that works to persuade fundamentalist Christian attendees of the terminal severity with which a perpetually changing world threatens their religious freedom. This is really an awesome picture. Answers in Genesis, this company, they utilize canine units in the museum to lend further legitimacy to the perception of Christian fundamentalists as a persecuted people. As of 2020, and this is remarkable, Answers in Genesis is home to the largest private security explosives detection canine unit in the state of Kentucky. This is an interesting photo here shared with me by Dr. William Trollinger of the Answers in Genesis canine team doing a joint training exercise with several local police departments in front of the Ark, which is a whole different rhetorical beast to try and think about. But this Ark is something that the Creation Museum, AIG built next to the Creation Museum. But AIG's canine force, it's so substantial that they often collaborate with local and state law enforcement entities on training exercises. I mean, you can see those are 3 different police vehicles there, from different departments in Kentucky. So they're significant, right? They've got 6 different dogs, or units, I guess. They're German Shepherds, they're Dutch Shepherds, Labs, Belgian Malinois, right? Very aggressive police dogs that are used for these purposes. And more importantly, they're used to detect threats that are beyond the sense capabilities of human beings. So the audience interpretation that follows from this fact is that the museum, it's not only subject to simple human disturbances, but to large-scale terrorist attacks, right? We're talking about bomb-sniffing dogs, 6 of them. So the museum attendee here, they're led to understand the Creation Museum in this way, not simply as a building in Kentucky, but as an ideological focal point that's subject to immense adversarial threats. So the security officer, their campaign hat, their .40 caliber handgun, the canine units, they're all supporting elements of a rhetorical phantasmagoria that lurks behind the scenes of a more explicit rhetorical message that's contained within the Creation Museum. A fundamental component of AIG's success is their ability to create a community of individuals that are tied together by something. And that thing, for fundamentalist Christians, is the identity of being a persecuted people. A visit to the Creation Museum is accompanied by a striking demonstration of force that constitutes one of the many tools that Ken Ham and AIG use to employ to lend credibility to the claim that the modern world is hostile to young earth creationism and biblical inerrancy. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of striking when you just think about it. But a very good question about this is, how does this pertain to CIT? How does this pertain to Catholic intellectual tradition? The argument that's posed by Ken Ham through his, I know, it's really a ballsy move to introduce Aristotle here, because everyone in the audience knows more about Aristotle than I do. But this argument that's posed by Ken Ham through his Creation Museum is that God is vengeful, right? And the experience of the museum, it's meant to position the visitor as someone who should be in fear. This is a point that Aristotle, a scholar which CIT relies upon quite heavily, helps us to see in Book 1 of his Rhetoric. He states that, quote, "The arousing of prejudice, pity, anger, and similar emotions has nothing to do with the essential facts, but is merely a personal appeal to the man who is judging the case." So fear, I would argue, qualifies as a similar emotion in this context in such a way that I guess what I'm saying is that Aristotle, he's illustrating how Ham and AIG use pathos as a mode of persuasion to instill fear in their audience. And on the other side of the coin, in contrast to this Aristotelian fear, is sort of something that Augustine is going to tell us, right? Augustine's conception of Christian faith in Book 1 of On Christian Doctrine argues that the most important lesson of Scripture is to love one's neighbor as oneself, and to love God and recognize God as the supreme good. In Ken Ham's interpretation of the Bible, God is a vengeful deity. He's a vengeful deity inciting fear into his followers. But according to the foundational scholars of Catholic intellectual tradition, and the sacramental spirit of Catholic intellectual tradition, I guess, here, Ken Ham, he's got it all wrong, right? Ultimately, Aristotle, he's illuminating the rhetorical strategy of pathos in the form of fear that Ken Ham is propagating with the Creation Museum, and Augustine here is demonstrating that this is a gross misreading of the Bible that we see at the Creation Museum. So therefore, this paper, it is related to Catholic intellectual tradition in how its argument deeply pertains to well-known voices within CIT, and more importantly, how this paper seeks to correct a vengeful reading of the Bible with the loving interpretation that is so characteristic of Catholic intellectual tradition. And that's all that I have for you today. I wanted to thank you all very much for being here.
We do have some time for questions for Jules.
Brother Tom.
You know, when you had the slide up about your statement about abortion and about, they distinguish it makes me wonder, would they really object to violence in other forms, if it were for a good reason?
Because of the specificity
Or
of the
capital
same.
punishment, or, I mean, I guess I'm just imagining that many among them would not oppose capital punishment or necessarily using force to defend their beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's probably you're right about that. You know, knowing a lot of the people that have been to the Creation Museum, having been there myself, that's probably the case. And that's, you know, you have to talk to a lawyer about like what the actual grammatical breakdown is, right? Of like, okay, so what is included in this, right? Where are the commas, like, you know, so what are you technically agreeing to? So I think you're right that they probably would, you know, be okay with all sorts of different forms of taking a human life.
Did you feel, when you were taking pictures, did you feel a little bit unsafe?
I did, yeah, I did. I would say that. I think the reason for that primarily is because of the way they look. Like, you know, I think, and maybe just contemporary political climates, it's very much like taking videos of police officers is a controversial thing to do, and it can be, like, as we've seen, it can be a very dangerous thing to do. But that's not a police officer. So it's like I'm fooling myself into thinking that I'm doing something that's dangerous when I'm not, right? I mean, so yeah, I shouldn't have been afraid, but you know, it was kind of sketchy, I feel like.
I want to say I really enjoyed this presentation. I'm from Kentucky and actually grew up near the Ark, and even was like family friends of the family that were younger creationists. I want to say I think I have like experienced firsthand that sort of fear of the new wave or the new change persecuting an old way of life. I think it was very interesting to see that in sort of my personal experience through a scholarly lens. So I really appreciated that. Also, I saw a police car from my hometown.
Nice, cool, thank you. Mom?
A question only your mother could ask you. One of your best friends in the whole world did his senior thesis advocating for the Creation Museum.
Yes, you did.
And I just wonder, I mean, this is, for me, it's so interesting to see this in light of what we know about this individual who we love. I wonder, are you ever going to talk to him about this paper? Is this something that you're ever going to, like, have a conversation with Jonathan about? I'm really curious. How do you handle someone in your life who you love, who's a fundamentalist Christian, who absolutely believes in that museum?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's challenging because it just coincidentally happened to land at a university with two of like the most prominent scholars that oppose what happens at the Creation Museum and at the Ark.
Just by chance, maybe God led you there.
You know, I mean, and I think it's really when you read the Writing America from Dr. Bill and Sue Trollinger, you realize it's a pretty weak argument, and you realize also how many terrible museums there are in the world. Like, really, just not every museum is great, and they think they are, but they're not. And yeah, so for example, like if you pull the text from the walls, like inside the Creation Museum, they're from a lot of different translations of the Bible. So like, there's not one Bible that Ken Ham is reading, and that he's taking quotes from. He's using quotations from lots of different versions of the Bible to support exactly what he wants to say. Right? So there are facts like that, I mean, how do you defend that? You know, how can you say that you're sending one message from one Bible when you're not? And I mean, yeah, it would be challenging, I think, to have that conversation. But, you know, it's part of life. So I think probably no, I wouldn't have that conversation.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you guys again.